Hey guys, tonight we're going to peel back the curtain on something utterly fascinating and perhaps a little less appetizing from history. Imagine stepping back in time, way back to an era before refrigeration, before imported spices were cheap, before sanitation was, well, sanitary. It's the Middle Ages. And if you were just an average person, you probably won't survive dinner. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where and when you're watching this. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake up with the sun, the air cool and damp in your small dwelling. The smell of damp earth and perhaps a nearby animal lingers. Your stomach rumbles, a familiar ache. It's time for breakfast, or perhaps just the first meal of the day, whenever that might be. You step outside, and the world around you is vibrant in its muted way. Greens are intense, browns are earthy, but the palette of your potential pantry not quite as colorful as you might hope. Welcome to the bland age, where culinary excitement wasn't exactly on the daily menu for most people. The premise we're exploring tonight is simple, yet perhaps a little provocative. Medieval food, for the majority of the population, wasn't exactly a gourmet paradise. Forget what you've seen in movies about feasts groaning under the weight of roasted swans. Those were very much the exception. Usually for royalty or the super rich. For the average peasant and even many townspeople, daily meals were, let's just say, functional. They provided calories, sometimes, but rarely thrills. You look around your small village or farm, and you begin to understand why. Ingredients are limited. What grows here, right now, is what you eat. There's no hopping in a car to the grocery store for bell peppers from a different hemisphere. If it's winter, you're relying on things that store well. Root vegetables, grains, maybe some dried beans, fresh greens, a distant, seasonal dream. Meat. Unless you own livestock or are lucky with hunting, poaching, and not caught, it's a rare treat. Fish might be available if you live near water, especially on fasting days dictated by the church, which were numerous. Lent wasn't just a few weeks. You could easily have over 100 fasting days a year where meat was off limits. This limitation wasn't just geographical. It was deeply tied to the calendar and religious dictates, adding another layer of restriction to your already limited choices. Eating. Historians still argue whether the abundance of fish on fast days actually led to specific aquaculture techniques, or if people just ate more dried and salted herring. The lack of reliable preservation methods is another huge hurdle. You can dry things, like herbs or some fruits. You can salt meat or fish, which gives it a long shelf life, but also makes it incredibly salty and often tough. Smoking helps too, but freezing, canning, refrigeration. These concepts are centuries away. Milk spoils quickly. Fresh meat must be eaten almost immediately, or preserved quickly and crudely. This means you often eat things that are on the verge of going bad, or have been processed in ways that drastically alter their taste and texture, often for the worse. Imagine eating salted fish every single day for weeks on end. Sounds appealing, right? It makes you appreciate your freezer and fridge in a whole new way. And then there's the hygiene, or rather, the distinct lack thereof. Clean water isn't always easy to come by, and understanding germ theory is, well, non-existent. Food preparation surfaces might be questionable. Utensils are basic, often just a knife and spoon. If that, hands aren't washed with soap and hot water like we do today. This isn't just about being a little bit dirty. It means that whatever limited ingredients you have are often prepared in conditions ripe for contamination. Food poisoning was a common and often fatal occurrence. It adds a certain risk to your dining experience that we modern folks are thankfully spared. It's like playing a culinary game of Russian roulette every time you sit down to eat. Though, to be fair, the wealthy had more access to clean water and separate kitchens, reducing some risk. But they weren't immune. So, you're living in a world where your diet is dictated by the season, limited by geography, restricted by religion, and constantly battling against spoilage and unseen contaminants. Your meals likely consist of various porridges or stews made from grains like barley, rye, or oats, and whatever vegetables are in season. Perhaps thickened with peas or beans. If you're lucky, a little bit of potage, a thick soup or stew, might have a tiny piece of salted meat or fish. Bread is a staple, but depending on your status, it might be coarse and heavy, made from cheaper grains like rye or even ground legumes. The finely sifted white bread was, you guessed it, for the rich, a slightly quirky tidbit. The poor often ate bread that was so hard and stale it could double as a plate, called a trencher, not, which would soak up the juices from their meal before being eaten or given to the dogs or beggars. Talk about multi-purpose dining ware. Compared to the diverse year-round availability we enjoy today, medieval food for the masses was undeniably bland, repetitive, and sometimes outright unsafe. It wasn't about flavor profiles or presentation. It was about survival. Getting enough calories was the goal, and taste was a distant second, if it factored in at all. Imagine your favorite comfort food. Now imagine eating it every single day, made with questionable ingredients, prepared in murky conditions. Takes the shine off a bit, doesn't it? It's a stark reminder of how much our relationship with food and our expectations of it have changed. This initial glimpse into the medieval kitchen, or lack thereof, sets the stage for understanding the constraints people faced. You can almost taste the monotony, feel the grittiness of the coarse bread, smell the heavy salt of preserved meat. It's not exactly making your mouth water, is it? And this is just the beginning of our journey into the culinary realities of the past. Hors Okay, so as you're settling into this little medieval corner we've carved out tonight, feeling that, let's just say, rustic air around you, you quickly realize something fundamental about survival here. More than anything else, your life, your energy, your very existence revolves around one thing, one absolute, undeniable staple. Grain AF. Forget the fancy feasts you might have seen in movies, the roasted meats, the intricate pastries. For 90-something% of the population, the vast majority of your daily calories, the stuff that puts a literal lump in your belly and keeps you upright, comes from cereal grains. And most often, it comes in the form of bread. But please, do not picture a fluffy golden brown loaf from your local bakery. Oh no, the bread you eat, morning, noon, and night, is a different beast entirely. You reach out, pick up a chunk from the rough wooden table. It's dark, not just a little whole wheat dark, but dark. Often it's made from rye or barley, maybe a mix, sometimes with oats thrown in. Wheat is the preferred grain. Sure, it makes the nicest bread, but wheat needs better land, more careful cultivation, and honestly, it's often destined for the Lord's table or for sale, not yours. So, you're dealing with the hardier grains, the ones that grow where others won't, the ones that yield something substantial, the crust. It's thick, hard. You could probably knock someone out with a stale loaf, maybe even build a small wall. This isn't soft and yielding bread. It's structural. And when you bite into it, or rather, saw into it with your teeth, you encounter the texture. It's dense, heavy, and gritty. Oh, is it gritty? Why the grit? Well, think about how that grain got from in the field to your mouth. You're not using sterile, high-tech metmers. You're using stone querns, maybe watermills or windmills if you're lucky enough to live near one and your lord allows access. These millstones grind the grain, but they also, inevitably, grind themselves. Tiny fragments of stone break off and get mixed in with the flour. Add to that the fact that the winnowing process, separating the grain from the chaff, the straw, the wheat seeds, wasn't perfect, and storage grain was stored in barns, often subject to pests. So, when you're eating your bread, you're getting dietary fiber, yes. You're also getting small bits of stone, fragments of husk, maybe a little protein from tiny, unwelcome visitors in the grain store. It adds character. Let's go with that. It adds a certain crunch that wasn't necessarily intended. Historians still argue whether the chronic tooth wear seen in medieval skeletons was more due to the stone grit in the bread or just the sheer hardness of the loaves themselves. Either way, your dentist here would be making a fortune. If dentists existed, or fortunes, while bread is king, especially when you need something portable or just as solid. Much of your grain intake also comes in softer forms, gruels and porridges. Mornings often start with a bowl of lukewarm, watery gruel, basically grain boiled in water until it's a murky, somewhat thickened liquid. It's bland, it's monotonous, but it's warm and it fills you up for a little while. Think oatmeal, but less appealing, less sweetened, and probably less clean. You might add a little salt, maybe a stray herb if you're lucky, but mostly it's just boiled grain. Rye, porridge, barley porridge, oat porridge. This stuff is the fuel of the common person, the energy source that lets you get through a day of backbreaking labor in the fields. The options are indeed limited. Barley is common because it's hardy. Rye is popular in colder climates for the same reason. Oats are often seen as feed for animals, but they absolutely make it into the human diet, especially for the poorer folk. Wheat, as mentioned, is aspirational. You dream of white bread? The kind the Lord eats, made from finely sifted wheat flour. That white bread is the status symbol, the equivalent of, I don't know, a really fancy artisanal sourdough today, except your dark, gritty loaf is the absolute baseline, the culinary bedrock of your entire existence. A fascinating, if slightly grim, mainstream historical fact is just how much grain an average person consumed. Estimates suggest it was often over a pound of bread per day for a working adult, sometimes significantly more, making up 70–80% of their total caloric intake. Imagine eating that much of this. Challenging substance. The milling process itself is a whole situation. You lug your grain to the mill, wait in line, pay the miller often in a portion of your grain, called multure, out, and hope they don't cheat you by taking too much or swapping your good grain for something worse. The miller is a figure of essential service, but also frequent suspicion, and the resulting flour. It's wholemeal in the most literal sense. Everything but the absolute largest pieces of straw is in there. The bran, the germ, the bits of husk, the weed seeds, the stone fragments. It's all getting mixed with water. Maybe a bit of yeast, if you can keep a starter going, which is its own challenge, and baked in a communal oven. The result is that dark, heavy, gritty loaf you're holding. It's not a culinary choice. It's economic reality. A quirky tidbit, the quality of bread was such a big deal, and so prone to fraud by bakers making loaves smaller or using cheaper ingredients, that many towns had strict regulations. and punishments for breaking them could include being dragged through the streets with the offending loaf tied around your neck. Talk about public shaming. So, you eat your bread. You dip it in watery soup or stew to soften it slightly. You gnaw on it plain. You crumble it into your gruel to make it more substantial. You rely on it completely. It's hard. It's often stale quickly. You bake large batches less frequently. And yes, it's definitely gritty. But it's food. It's survival. It's grit. It's gruel. It's grain. And you better get used to it. Because this is what's for dinner, and breakfast, and lunch, probably every day. Hope you like chewing. And speaking of filling your belly, you move on, past the smoky fire pits, and now you find yourself standing in a space where the air smells less of roasting meat and more, well, more of damp earth and simmering water. Welcome to the wonderful world of medieval vegetables and fruits. Prepare your taste buds, or maybe don't, because this is where things get a little boiled to oblivion. Remember how we talked about the limitations on medieval life earlier? Yeah, that definitely extended to the produce aisle. Forget the riot of color and options you see at your local grocery store today. You're not going to find 30 types of lettuce, exotic mangoes flown in from halfway across the world, or even a decent selection of bell peppers here. The variety available to the average person is significantly limited. You're dealing with root vegetables like carrots, often purple or yellow, not the vibrant orange we know, parsnips, turnips, onions, garlic, and maybe some cabbage or kale. Beans and peas are around, offering some much-needed protein. Fruits. They exist, thankfully, but again, seasonality is everything. Apples, pears, plums, cherries, berries when they're in season, and nuts. That's largely your lot. You can't just nip down to the corner store for strawberries in December. Everything is tied, absolutely tied, to the sun and the soil. You eat what's ripe, or you eat what keeps. And how do you eat it? See, yes. The cooking method of choice for pretty much everything. Leafy or rooty boiling, and not just a quick blanch. We're talking long drawn-out boiling, simmering for hours, turning potentially vibrant, flavorful ingredients into, well, mush. This isn't just about culinary preference, though you might wonder if they even had preferences beyond not starving. Boiling water was safer than raw water. Remember that. And cooking vegetables for a long time made them softer, easier to digest, and perhaps more palatable to teeth that might not have been in the best shape. Plus, it was an efficient way to cook multiple things in one pot over that precious fire. The downside, boiling the living daylights out of everything, pretty much strips it of its nutritional value. Vitamins, poof, gone into the water, which you might not even drink unless it's in a soup or stew. Flavor, also largely boiled away, leaving behind something bland that relied heavily on a pinch of precious salt, or perhaps some onions and garlic for any semblance of taste. It's the kind of cooking that makes you appreciate modern refrigeration and cookbooks that advise steaming or roasting. You just imagine a medieval cook stirring a pot of beige mush, sighing and thinking, well, it's food. This reliance on a few basic, often boiled, options highlights a key difference between the medieval diet and ours. While the wealthy might have had access to a slightly wider range through trade or larger gardens, the vast majority were working with a fairly monotonous palate. You get used to the earthy taste of boiled turnips, because that's often what's on offer, day after day, season after season. It makes you wonder if they ever fantasized about, like, a crispy roasted potato or a fresh, crunchy salad. Probably not, as those concepts wouldn't have even existed for them. It's a bit like living in a world where the only color is beige. But you don't know other colors exist. Now, where did these limited supplies come from? Primarily, your own efforts. For many, especially in rural areas, this meant a combination of gardening and wild foraging. If you had a small plot of land, you'd cultivate those reliable staples: cabbage, onions, leeks, peas, beans, root vegetables. These garden crops formed the backbone of the vegetable diet, providing a more consistent, albeit still seasonal, supply. You tend your little patch, hoping pests don't eat it all before you do. It's a constant battle against nature, requiring significant time and labor, but the countryside also offered a bounty for those who knew where to look. Wild foraging played a significant role. Supplementing the garden produce, you'd venture into woods and fields to gather wild greens like nettles or sorrel, berries like wild strawberries or raspberries when in season, nuts like hazelnuts and walnuts in the autumn, and perhaps even wild herbs for flavor or medicinal purposes. This foraging required knowledge, knowing what was edible, what was poisonous, and where to find things. It added a bit of variety and nutrition that might be missing from the boiled garden fare. It was also often a task for women and children. Historians still argue whether wild foraging provided a significant calorie contribution or was primarily for supplementing vitamins and variety, particularly for the poor. But either way, it was a riskier proposition than gardening. You might find nothing, or worse, find something that made you sick. Think of it like this. Your medieval grocery store is your small garden plot and the surrounding wilderness. Your inventory is limited, seasonal, and often requires you to actively search for it. And your primary cooking method turns everything into something that tastes suspiciously similar, regardless of what it started as. It really puts into perspective our modern abundance, doesn't it? You walk into a supermarket today and are faced with literally thousands of options from every corner of the globe, available year-round. Medieval folks had, generously, perhaps a few dozen types of plant foods available locally throughout the year, most of which would end up in a pot of boiling water. One mainstream historical fact we know is that pulses, beans, and peas were absolutely crucial for protein in the medieval diet, especially for those who couldn't afford meat or fish regularly. They were grown in gardens, relatively easy to store dried, and could be boiled into hearty pottages. A quirkier tidbit. Medieval people didn't really eat salads as we know them. Raw vegetables and greens were often viewed with suspicion, thought to cause illness or imbalances in the body's humors. Plus, washing water might not be safe, making raw consumption risky. So, that crisp green salad with a vinaigrette. Not happening in medieval times? Everything cooked, everything soft, everything boiled. So, you picture the medieval plate a chunk of bread, maybe some boiled pottage made of peas, and whatever root vegetables were available. Perhaps some boiled cabbage. It's filling, it's survival food, but it's probably not winning any culinary awards. It makes you appreciate the humble carrot, the everyday apple, in a whole new way, doesn't it? Knowing just how limited things were, and how they were often rendered nutrient poor and bland through cooking. It's like ordering a gourmet meal only for the chef to serve you a lukewarm, gray soup that tastes vaguely of dirt. Enjoy your meal. Okay, so you're living your life, maybe tending your small plot, or working for someone else, and you've got your pottage simmering, probably some bread baking if you're lucky. But where's the beef, or the pork, or anything with 4 legs that isn't a work animal, or your neighbor's precious cow? The truth is, for most people, most of the time, meat was not a regular feature on the dinner table. Forget popping down to the supermarket for a pack of chicken breasts, or grilling a steak whenever you fancy. Meat was expensive, It required land to raise animals, land you likely didn't own, and even if you could get your hands on an animal, butchering was a whole process. And then you had to make it last. So, if you did get meat, maybe after a harvest, or if a village animal had to be slaughtered, or perhaps you managed to snare a rabbit or catch a bird, it was a big deal, a rare treat. And when you did get it, you weren't getting tenderloin, folks. Oh no. You were likely dealing with the cuts that nobility turned their noses up at. We're talking neck, shanks, trotters, the parts that require long slow cooking to even become remotely edible. And don't forget the organ meats, liver, kidneys, tripe, brains. These were often the most accessible and cheapest parts, packed with nutrients, but definitely requiring a certain enthusiasm to prepare and eat. Imagine sitting down to a plate of heavily boiled tripe after a long day's work. It's nutritious, sure, but it's a far cry from Sunday roast. Your teeth would get a workout. Let me tell you, you might need a medieval dentist sooner rather than later, which, spoiler alert, wasn't exactly a spa experience. Now, because you couldn't just put leftovers in the fridge because, no fridges. Preservation was key. Absolutely essential. And the main ways to preserve meat involved two things: salt and smoke. Lots and lots and lots of salt. You'd rub vast quantities of salt into the meat, pulling out moisture and creating an environment hostile to the bacteria that would otherwise make it rot. Then, you might hang it in a smokehouse, letting the smoke further dry and permeate the meat, adding another layer of preservation and flavor. The result, meat that was intensely salty. Like, make your lips pucker, need to drink a gallon of water salty. It also became incredibly hard and dry. The texture was drastically altered. That tender flesh, gone. Replaced by something leathery, dense, and chewy. Think of the driest jerky you've ever had. Then multiply that dryness and saltiness by 10. Preparing this meat for eating often involved soaking it for hours, sometimes days, in water to draw out some of the salt, and then simmering it for an equally long time to try and soften it up. Even after all that, it was still tough and had that pervasive, smoky, salty flavor. It wasn't just seasoning, it was the dominant taste. You ate this preserved meat out of necessity, knowing it would last through the winter, providing calories and some precious protein when fresh food was scarce. It was fuel, stored survival, rather than a culinary delight. This leads us to a stark contrast. While you, the common person, were gnawing on boiled, salt-cured beef trotters or smoky pig's ears that tasted mostly of the chimney, the nobility were living a different meat reality entirely. Remember the concept of sumptuary laws we might touch on later? They applied to food too, indirectly. The wealthy had access to fresh meat, roasted swans, venison if they had hunting rights, prime cuts of pork and beef, fresh poultry. They could afford to slaughter animals and eat them relatively quickly, or use less extreme preservation methods if needed. Their banquets featured variety, tenderness, and flavors not dominated by sheer preservation. A mainstream historical fact is that access to fresh meat, especially large game like deer, was often legally restricted, reinforcing the divide between the classes and their diets. Historians still argue whether the average peasant ate meat weekly, monthly, or even less often. Outside of specific feast days or times of plenty after a harvest, it really varied by region, time period, and individual circumstances. But the consistent picture is that it was a luxury, a quirky tidbit about this tough meat reality. Sometimes dried and salted meat was so hard it was literally used as a form of currency or easy to transport rations on journeys, like a medieval power bar. though I imagine chewing it required significant jaw strength. Maybe they had stronger jaw muscles back then. Who knows? It certainly wasn't a melt-in-your-mouth experience. So next time you complain about your steak being slightly overdone, just imagine having to eat meat that felt like a heavily salted, smoked shoe, and be grateful for modern refrigeration and butchers who know what they're doing. Chewing through that tough stuff was part of the daily grind, literally and figuratively. Okay, you've managed to cobble together some sort of meal, maybe even kept it from being eaten by those critters we talked about earlier. But now you're thinking about adding some flavor, some richness. You look around, and there's a chicken pecking nervously nearby, maybe a goat or a cow tethered somewhere, and your thoughts drift to dairy and eggs. Ah, the simple pleasures. Right. Except, without a humming refrigerator, these simple pleasures quickly become less simple and significantly more risky. You eye that bucket of milk, left out in the sun just a little too long. The air around it already feels thick, smells tangy, not in a pleasant yogurt sort of way, but more like something's decided to throw a sour party and everyone's invited, except you, unless you like gastric distress. This is the immediate, in-your-face challenge of dairy. That fresh, warm milk straight from the udder. It's a ticking clock. Bacteria, the tiny little guys we mostly ignore in our modern world thanks to pasteurization and refrigeration, are having an absolute field day in that warm, nutrient-rich liquid. They multiply faster than your excuses for not doing laundry. 1 minute it's milk, the next it's, well, curdled sadness and a one-way ticket to a bad time. Remember that feeling of opening a carton of milk just past its date? Now imagine that, but instead of just smelling a little off, it's actively trying to poison you. Fresh milk is incredibly difficult to keep safe. You can boil it, sure, but that only buys you a little time, maybe a day if you're lucky and the weather's cool. And boiling changes the taste, making it less milky. So, drinking fresh milk as a regular thing. Unless you're milking the animal and drinking it immediately, still warm, it's probably off the menu for sustained survival, unless you enjoy playing dairy roulette. Eggs present their own set of issues, though maybe slightly less immediate than milk. A fresh egg has some natural defenses, a protective bloom on the shell that helps keep bacteria out. But wash that off, or let the egg sit in questionable conditions, and those defenses are compromised. You can't just keep a carton of 24 eggs for weeks on end like you might be used to. Each egg is an individual gamble. You pick one up, feel its temperature. Is it warm from the hen, or has it been sitting? You might hold it up to the light, looking for signs of questionable contents inside, a rotten egg. Oh, you know that smell, right? That sulfurous and soul-crushing stench that can clear a room faster than mentioning taxes without refrigeration. You're relying on freshness, speed, and a lot of praying that Mrs. Clucksworth laid that egg recently, and it hasn't been exposed to anything nasty. Spoilage isn't just a bad taste. It's a genuine health hazard, introducing pathogens that can make you seriously, debilitatingly ill. And being seriously ill when there are no hospitals. Yeah, that's not ideal. So, how did people manage to incorporate dairy into their diets beyond the immediate consumption of fresh, risky milk preservation? Of course, and this is where cheese and butter step onto the stage. Looking like the culinary heroes they are, cheesemaking is essentially a sophisticated method of controlled spoilage, which sounds way less appealing than it is. You deliberately introduce beneficial bacteria or enzymes rennet to curdle the milk, separating the solid curds from the liquid whey. By removing the water, you create an environment much less welcoming to the bad bacteria that cause rapid spoilage. Then, Depending on the type of cheese, you might salt it. Salt is a fantastic preservative. Age it further drying and developing flavor or texture, or even introduce specific molds that help preserve it. A hard, aged cheese, like a historical cheddar or Parmesan equivalent, can last for a very long time without refrigeration. A stark contrast to that bucket of milk. You see, wheels of cheese, carefully wrapped or coated, stored in cool cellars, if you have a cellar, that is. They require skill to make, time to cure, and the right conditions to store. But they offer a relatively safe, calorie-dense food source from milk that would otherwise be wasted. It's a historical marvel, really. The process transforms a fleeting liquid into something solid, stable, and packed with nutrients. Butter is another lifesaver, though maybe a slightly greasier one. You churn cream the fat separated from milk until the fat solids clump together, leaving behind buttermilk. This butter, especially if well made and salted, also keeps much better than fresh milk. The high fat content and lower water activity make it more resistant to bacterial growth than milk. Salted butter in particular was a common way to preserve this valuable fat for storage and transport. You'd pack it tightly to remove air, perhaps wrap it in cloth or leaves, and store it in a cool place. It might go rancid eventually, developing off flavors as the fats break down. But it wouldn't typically harbor the same level of dangerous bacteria as spoiled milk or eggs. Think of it as a semi-preserved energy block. You can spread it, cook with it, or just eat a chunk for calories. It's a way to capture the energy from milk fats and make it last. However, even with these methods, you face limitations. Cheese making requires specific knowledge, tools, and conditions. Making good butter takes effort, and both still require a source of milk, which means you need healthy dairy animals, raising and keeping these animals fed, watered, and healthy, protecting them from predators like those we discussed before or disease, is a constant chore. It's not like you can just pop to the store for milk and eggs. You are the store, the farmer, the processor, and the quality control. A mainstream historical fact for millennia. Across many cultures, fermenting milk into products like yogurt, kefir, cheese, or even mildly alcoholic drinks was the primary way to preserve dairy and make it safer to consume compared to fresh milk. This wasn't just about taste. It was a necessity for survival in climates where milk would quickly spoil. A quirky tidbit. Did you know that historically, butter was sometimes stored underwater in Ireland and Scotland? Bog butter. Butter packed into wooden containers or animal bladders and buried in peat bogs has been found centuries later, preserved by the bog's anaerobic, acidic conditions. Talk about extreme long-term storage. Historians still argue whether the primary driver for the widespread adoption of dairying in early agricultural societies was the direct consumption of fresh milk. Despite the digestive challenges many early humans faced with lactose, or primarily for producing longer-lasting, safer products like cheese and yogurt. It's a classic chicken or egg debate, but with milk. So, as you contemplate your survival pantry, you realize that reliable dairy and eggs aren't guaranteed. You might get fresh ones now and then, a rare treat. But for consistent nutrition from these sources, you're looking at labor-intensive, knowledge-dependent preservation methods like cheese making and butter production. And even then, things can go wrong. A bad batch of cheese, butter that goes rancid. It's a constant battle against nature, time, and microscopic organisms trying to make your food their home. It makes you appreciate the simple, refrigerated carton of milk just a little bit more, doesn't it? You carefully check the egg in your hand again. Maybe give it a little sniff, hoping for the best. Okay, let's settle back into it. You've followed the paths, smelled the salt spray, maybe even imagined yourself haggling in a crowded port. But who exactly was doing the buying and doing the using of these precious finds? Because let's be real, that little shaker of pepper on your table, or that jar of cinnamon gathering dust after holiday baking, that's not quite the vibe back then. At all. You see, these incredible substances, the fiery bite of pepper, the warming zest of ginger, the sweet, fragrant curl of cinnamon bark, they weren't just ingredients. Not like you toss some garlic powder on chicken these days without a second thought. Oh no. These were jewels. These were treasures. Owning them. Using them. It was the ultimate flex. We're talking serious. Serious money. Imagine if your spice rack cost more than your car? Or your house? Maybe your whole street. That's the kind of league we're playing in here. Think about it. The sheer distance, the danger, the multiple middlemen each taking their cut that we've already touched upon. All of that added up, making the price astronomical by the time these spices reached European tables. Pepper, often called black gold, was so valuable it was literally used as currency in some instances. It's a mainstream historical fact that landlords in certain periods and places accepted peppercorns as rent. Like, here's your lease renewal. That'll be 50 pounds of pepper. Please. Can you imagine trying to pay your landlord with peppercorns today? You'd probably get a very confused look, followed by an eviction notice. Maybe if you ground it up and claimed it was very expensive artisanal dust, probably not. So, who had 50 pounds of pepper just lying around? Not your average farmer or blacksmith, that's for sure. This puts these spices squarely in the realm of the incredibly wealthy kings, queens, high nobility, the most powerful merchants and clergy. Your access to things like ginger or cinnamon was a direct indicator of your status, your power, your ability to afford the utterly unattainable. Serving dishes heavily seasoned with these imported delights at a feast wasn't just about making the food taste good. It was a dazzling display of wealth and global connection. It was saying, without saying anything, look at me. I can afford to sprinkle gold dust on my dinner. Except the gold dust was spicy and delicious and probably cost more than gold dust sometimes. And let's talk about that taste. While the incredible flavors were definitely prized, there's another, slightly less glamorous reason these potent spices were so popular with the rich. You know how you just pop to the grocery store and get fresh ingredients today? Maybe check the sell-by date. Yeah, that wasn't always an option. Refrigeration didn't exist. Food preservation was limited salting, pickling, smoking, all of which also affect flavor. Meat, fish, and other perishables, especially after traveling some distance or sitting around for a bit. Well, they could develop certain characteristics, smells, tastes that weren't exactly ideal. Enter the heavy hand of expensive spices. A generous amount of pepper, ginger, or cinnamon wouldn't just add flavor. It could help mask those less than fresh notes, not necessarily hiding outright rotten food, though maybe sometimes, but perhaps covering up the slightly gamey taste of meat that wasn't just killed, or the faint whiff of the sea that clung a bit too long to a piece of fish. It was like nature's very expensive, very spicy Fabrezi for dinner. You weren't just masking unpleasantness. You were doing it with ingredients that cost a fortune, turning a potential culinary misstep into a demonstration of abundance. This pheasant might be experienced, you'd think. But wow, listen to that pepper pop. Clearly I spared no expense. There's a specific kind of ginger, for instance, known as preserved ginger, which was essentially ginger cooked in sugar syrup. This wasn't just a confection. It was a way to make valuable ginger last longer and be transportable, often arriving as sticky, intensely flavored chunks. Imagine unwrapping one of these. The sharp, sweet, slightly medicinal scent filling the air, a true sensory experience miles from its origin. This preserved form, and even the belief in ginger's warming and health properties, like some historical notions that it could ward off plague, a less-known tidbit added to its mystique and desirability among those who could afford it. It wasn't just a seasoning, it was exotic medicine and a luxury candy all in one. This dual use, flavor and masking, is something historians still argue whether the masking aspect was a primary motivation for the rich using so many spices, or simply a practical side effect of wanting strongly flavored, luxurious food anyway. Did they load up on pepper for tugger because the meat was a bit off, or did they just love pepper and it conveniently helped? If the meat was a bit off, it's like asking if you put extra cheese on something because you love cheese, or because you burnt it slightly and the cheese helps. Probably a bit of both, right? But when the cheese costs a king's ransom, the motivation gets a little more scrutiny. The visual and olfactory appeal was part of the prestige too. Imagine a platter arriving at your table, steam rising, not just smelling of roasted meat, but layered with the sharp tang of ginger, the deep warmth of cinnamon, the fiery punch of pepper. It was an assault on the senses, designed to impress. Your less fortunate neighbors could only dream of such aromas. Their food smelled, well, probably just of food, and maybe smoke from the fire. Much less exciting. So, next time you casually grab your spice grinder, take a moment. Imagine that every sprinkle is costing you the equivalent of a small car payment. Imagine that the simple act of seasoning your dinner is a declaration of extreme wealth and access to the furthest corners of the globe. It really puts things into perspective, doesn't it? The journey, the risk, the cost, all for a pinch of flavor. But for the rich, it was never just about the flavor. It was about everything that pinch represented. Okay, so you've navigated the basics, the daily grind of this less than convenient existence. You understand the value of clean water, a sturdy roof, maybe even that slightly too loud neighbor. But let's talk about something you likely take for granted every single day. Now sweetness? Yep, just that simple burst of sugar on your tongue. In this world, that feeling, it's practically a myth for most. Remember how we talked about things being scarce, about luxuries being redefined? Well, sweetness falls squarely into the extreme luxury category. Forget those sugary cereals, the afternoon cookie breaks, the sweet coffee drinks that probably cost more than you earn in a week here anyway. They just don't exist. The primary source of anything remotely sweet you might encounter is honey, not the little plastic bear squirting liquid gold. Mind you, this is raw, potentially bee-filled, wild or laboriously farmed honey. Think about what it takes to get honey. You need bees, obviously, and bees, in this less controlled environment, are fussy. Then you need someone brave or foolish enough to get it. Finding wild hives is dangerous. Remember those predators we talked about? They like easy meals, and a human messing with angry bees looks pretty inviting. Even if you're farming bees, it requires skill, specialized equipment that's probably hard to maintain, and a lot of patience. It's a risky, labor-intensive endeavor, making honey a precious commodity right from the start. When you do encounter honey, maybe in a market, maybe as part of a trade, it's not cheap. It's priced more like a spice or a medicine than a food staple. A small pot of honey could easily cost you days or even a week's worth of labor or bartered goods. It's something you savor. Maybe a tiny spoonful added to a drink for someone who is ill, or a rare special treat for a child on a significant day. You certainly aren't slathering it on, well, anything, really, because bread is probably too valuable anyway. It's a concentrated form of value, a liquid asset you protect fiercely. Compare that to your old life. where sugar is in everything. In soda, sauces, bread, even things you wouldn't expect. Here, that level of pervasive sweetness is unimaginable. Because sugar itself, granulated, refined sugar, it's virtually non-existent for 99% of the population. We're talking levels of rarity and expense that make gold look common. To even see refined sugar might require access to the very wealthiest merchants or nobility, and to possess even a small amount would be like holding a handful of jewels. Historically, this isn't entirely unheard of. You know, for a long time, sugar was incredibly rare and expensive in many parts of the world. A luxury item only for the elite. It was a sign of immense wealth to be able to offer sweetened foods. That mainstream historical fact might make this world feel a little more familiar, or maybe just reinforce how spoiled your modern palate is. And a quirky little tidbit. Before sugar became widely available, people used things like dried fruit powders or even root vegetables with natural sweetness to try and replicate that taste in dishes. Can you imagine trying to make, well, anything exciting with dried carrot powder instead of sugar? It's a bit like trying to sweeten your coffee with optimism and a stern look. Doesn't quite hit the same because sugar is so rare. Desserts, as you know them, are simply not a thing. Cakes, cookies, candies, ice cream, they are fantastical concepts. Like flying cars or universal health care. Even something as simple as a sweetened porridge or a piece of fruit that's been candied is a level of indulgence reserved for the truly powerful. The vast majority of people live their entire lives without tasting the intense, clean sweetness of sugar. Their palate is tuned to the subtle, earthy sweetness of root vegetables, maybe the occasional piece of fruit when it's in season and not needed for storage, or the precious, complex sweetness of that rare honey. Think about the sensory deprivation of it. No smell of baking cookies wafting from a kitchen. No sticky fingers from a spilled soda. No satisfying crunch of sugar crystals. Your taste buds are recalibrating to a much less sugary reality. That bitter herbal tea you might drink, it stays bitter. That plain bread, it stays plain. If you try to make something sweet using only what's available, you quickly learn the limitations. Honey cakes would be more accurately described as the slightly sweet bread that costs a fortune, if it exists at all. It's a world where the concept of a sweet tooth is abstract, almost mythological. Like, oh, I heard some legends say certain people have this strange craving for things that taste like, well, magic, I guess. Historians still argue whether the widespread introduction of cheap sugar did more to fuel the Industrial Revolution by providing cheap calories for laborers, or to contribute to global health problems. It's a complex topic, much like figuring out how you'd manage a birthday celebration here without a cake. Maybe you just sing awkwardly and hope someone has a tiny bit of honey. So, yeah, you might crave that hit of sugar, that familiar comfort food sweetness, but that craving is a relic of your old life. Here, sweetness is work. It's expensive. It's rare. It's a privilege, not a convenience. And understanding that makes you appreciate every single calorie, every single flavor, in a way you never had to before. It's a harsh lesson for your pampered taste buds, but hey, look on the bright side. At least you don't have to worry about cavities from excessive candy consumption. Unless, of course, you somehow manage to become one of the super rich. Then I guess you have different problems, like protecting your sugar hoard. Yeah, this world puts things in perspective, doesn't it? Even something as simple as enjoying a cookie. Okay, so you've managed to get through another day. Maybe you found a bit of food. Maybe you didn't. But there's one thing you absolutely need, and accessing it safely is a constant gamble. See, clean drinking water as we know it, Yeah, that's mostly a pipe dream. You walk past the muddy river. You see the stagnant pond. You watch people emptying things into the streams. It quickly dawns on you that just quenching your thirst with whatever's closest is a fast track to some truly awful stomach issues. Or worse. We're talking serious, potentially deadly illnesses. So, what do you drink? Ah, this is where the magic happens. Or, well, a kind of magic. Maybe not the kind that involves actual wizards, but the kind that keeps you alive. You turn to fermented beverages, primarily ale and beer. This isn't just for fun, though it certainly has its moments. This is often about survival. The brewing process, with the boiling of water, makes these drinks significantly safer than raw water scooped from a potentially contaminated source. Think of it as medieval Brita filter, except it gives you a gentle buzz. You see everyone, from the farmer in the field to the craftsman in the workshop, pausing to take a swig from their personal jug or a communal pot. It's not a luxury, it's a necessity woven into the fabric of daily life. These drinks aren't just safer, they're a vital source of calories. Remember how we talked about the often meager and repetitive diet? Ale provides energy, something you desperately need when you're doing backbreaking labor from dawn till dusk. It's liquid bread, essentially, for the poor, who might not get enough food. A few tankards of ale throughout the day can provide a significant portion of their daily required energy intake. You feel the warmth spread through your belly, a comforting weight that wards off some of the hunger pangs. It's thick, it's cloudy, and it's keeping you going. The quality of these drinks, well, it varies. Wildly, you have small ale, or small beer, which is brewed to be very weak, low in alcohol, maybe 1 to 2%, and intended for constant hydration throughout the day, even for children. You can drink gallons of this stuff without getting properly drunk, just maybe feeling a little mellow. Then there are stronger brews, saved for special occasions, feasts, or those who could afford the better ingredients in time. The taste can be anything from slightly sweet and malty to decidedly sour or bitter, depending on the grain, the brewing process, and frankly, how clean the equipment was. Sometimes you get a good batch, smooth and flavorful. Other times, well, you just hope it's safer than the water. You might pick up hints of herbs or spices sometimes, added not just for flavor, but also sometimes as preservatives, or to mask less than ideal tastes. It's a gamble every time you lift the cup. You notice the different colors and consistencies. Some are thin, like cloudy tea. Others are thick, almost like a thin gruel. This density is often tied to the calorie content and the amount of grain used. A thicker ale feels more substantial, more filling. You learn to recognize the look and smell of a decent brew, and maybe more importantly, the look and smell of one you should probably avoid unless you're truly desperate. It's an acquired skill. This medieval beverage connoisseurship. You sniff it cautiously. Yep, smells mostly all right. Better than the puddle outside. Anyway, historians still argue whether people truly avoided water completely or just prioritized fermented drinks when available. Was the default truly unsafe? Or is that a slight exaggeration based on later observations? It's hard to say definitively, but the evidence strongly suggests that for the vast majority of people, especially in populated areas, the risk from water was significant enough that ale was the preferred, everyday drink. Imagine that, starting your day, not with a glass of water, but a weak, warm ale. It's less refreshing in the way we think of it, more sustaining. Now, wine. Wine. You see the nobility drinking wine? You smell it sometimes. A richer, fruitier aroma wafting from the tavern where the wealthier folk gather. But for you, the poor laborer, the peasant, the average townsfolk, wine is a luxury. It's imported, expensive, and generally out of your reach. Maybe, just maybe, on a truly special festival day, your lord or a wealthy patron might provide some. Or you might pool your meager resources with friends for a single shared bottle. But your daily hydration and calorie needs, those are met by ale and beer. This class distinction in beverages is stark and clear. Wine signifies status, wealth, access to trade networks. Ale signifies, well, basic survival and being part of the common folk. It's like the difference between, I don't know, organic craft kombucha and just grabbing a carton of milk from the corner shop. Both liquid, both serve a purpose, but one costs way more and is definitely for show sometimes. One quirky tidbit. In some places and times, ale brewing was primarily a woman's job. Brewsters were the local ale makers, often doing it from their homes. They'd put an ale stake out, a pole with a bush or garland on the end, to let people know the ale was ready for sale. So, that cloudy, life-giving liquid you're drinking might have been made by the woman down the lane, not some big, fancy brewery. It was a common way for women to earn some independent income before men took over more and more commercial brewing later on. So, you raise your cup. It's not glamorous. It's not sparkling clean water from a tap, and it might taste a bit yeasty, but it's warm, it's filling, and most importantly, it's keeping you hydrated and alive without sending you straight to the medieval equivalent of A&E. You sip it slowly, feeling the slight warmth, the thick texture on your tongue. This is your daily bread, in liquid form. It's the unsung hero of your diet, the quiet guardian against disease lurking in the water. You finish the cup, wipe your mouth with the back of your hand, and feel a little bit more ready to face the rest of the day. Just don't expect to remember every detail of it after a few too many, even if it's just small ale. Though, honestly, getting properly drunk on this stuff would probably take more effort than you have energy for. And you realize, as you walk through the bustling but muddy streets, that something is missing, something we take utterly for granted today. It's the hum of refrigeration, the cool air of a freezer. See, everything you've seen so far, the fresh bread, the simmering stews, the roasted meat from the Lord's table, it all relies on being eaten now, or very, very soon. But what happens when the harvest is done, when the snow falls, and the fields are barren for months? Ah, yes, the great medieval question. How do you not starve to death between November and April? This is where the magic, or perhaps the necessary evil, of preservation steps in. You see huge barrels, mounds of shimmering white crystals, smoke curling from sheds, and things hanging from rafters that you hope are just fish. The medieval world, for most people, lived on a diet of things that had been, let's say, altered. The primary methods. Well, you've got your classic lineup: salting, smoking, drying, and pickling. Imagine vast quantities of meat and fish, not just a few cuts, but whole carcasses, caught or slaughtered when available. To keep them from simply rotting, they were absolutely packed in salt. This wasn't just a sprinkle, it was a burial. Salt draws out the moisture that bacteria need to grow. So, you rub it in, you layer it thick, you put the meat in a barrel, and you add more salt. Piles and piles of it, it's effective. Oh yes, it stops the rot dead in its tracks. Then there's smoking. Think of those dark, often small buildings with fires smoldering slowly inside. Meat, fish, sometimes cheese, would be hung from the rafters for days, weeks even, bathed in a cool, dense smoke. The compounds in the smoke have antibacterial properties. And again, the process helps to dry the food out. You can almost smell it, that acrid, persistent aroma clinging to everything near a smokehouse. Drying was simpler in principle, but weather-dependent. Grains, pulses, fruits, sometimes even thin strips of meat or fish would be spread out in the sun or near a slow fire to let the moisture evaporate. Think of peas laid out on cloths or apples sliced thin and strung up. It requires patience and good conditions, but you end up with something incredibly lightweight and portable, perfect for those long, hungry winters. And finally, pickling. Vegetables, often cabbage, onions, or root vegetables, would be submerged in brine, a strong solution of salt and water, or sometimes vinegar if it was available and affordable. This creates an acidic or extremely salty environment where spoilage organisms can't survive. But some beneficial fermentation can occur, adding new flavors and textures. Now, why were these essentials simple? Without them, the vast majority of food harvested during the productive months would spoil before winter was over. Imagine trying to survive from the last days of autumn until the first crops of spring on only fresh food. It would be impossible for most people. Preservation was the bridge, the absolute necessity that allowed communities to store enough calories to last through the lean season, for military campaigns, for long journeys, for simply making it to next year's harvest. This was the lifeline. You could say it was the medieval version of stocking up on canned goods, except way less convenient to eat. And it's a significant but. These methods fundamentally changed the food. Remember that lovely fresh bread you saw earlier? Contrast that with a piece of salt-cured pork that's been sitting in a barrel for 6 months. The texture, often tough, chewy, sometimes rock hard. You usually had to soak salted meat in water for hours, or even days, changing the water multiple times, just to make it palatable and reduce the overwhelming saltiness. Try taking a bite of dried fish without having soaked it first. It's like chewing on leather that tastes only of the sea and time. The taste was incredibly dominant. Salted food tasted only of salt, often to the point of burning your tongue. Smoked food tasted intensely smoky, sometimes masking the original flavor entirely. Dried food was concentrated and often required significant rehydration, and pickled food was powerfully sour or salty. This wasn't subtle seasoning. This was preservation dictating flavor. Your palate became accustomed to these extreme tastes and the nutritional value. Well, Nabri, that changed too. While preservation kept the calories and some macronutrients, the processing often degraded vitamins, particularly water-soluble ones like vitamin C. Eating a diet heavily reliant on dried, salted, and smoked foods, especially through winter with little fresh produce, could lead to deficiencies, scurvy. The dreaded lack of vitamin C wasn't just a sailor's disease. It could strike inland populations too, particularly towards the end of a long, hard winter. Eating barrel after barrel of salt fish might keep you alive, but it wasn't exactly a balanced diet. Historians still argue whether the medieval peasant diet provided sufficient nutrients year-round, particularly for vulnerable groups like children and the elderly. Given this reliance on preserved food, it makes you appreciate your freezer, doesn't it? Just a little bit. Imagine eating salted cabbage and smoked herring, day in, day out, for months. Your sodium intake must have been through the roof. Puts modern processed food to shame. Frankly, one slightly quirky tidbit salt was so vital and valuable for preservation that it was sometimes used to pay wages, giving rise to the phrase, "worth his salt." Though whether that phrase originated precisely in the medieval period or earlier is, perhaps ironically, another historical debate point. So, As you consider the winter pantry of a medieval household, picture rows of barrels, sacks of dried goods, and racks of hanging, smoke-darkened meat and fish. It's not a picture of culinary delight, but a stark image of survival, a testament to human ingenuity in the face of scarcity, and a diet that was effective at keeping you alive, even if it made your tongue tingle and your water bill incredibly high from all that soaking. So you've navigated the marketplace, maybe risked a quick bite from a street vendor, or perhaps you're settling in for a more formal meal in a manor hall. But before you lift that wooden spoon or slice into whatever questionable meat is on offer, let's talk about the real silent killers lurking in the medieval air, water, and food itself: hygiene, or the glorious lack thereof. Remember that lovely open sewer running down the middle of the street we mentioned? Yeah. That wasn't just an aesthetic choice. The sheer overwhelming reality of medieval life was that cleanliness, as we understand it, simply didn't exist for most people, and certainly not in the way that would prevent the spread of microscopic nasties. You see, nobody had a clue about germs. The very concept of tiny invisible creatures crawling over everything and making you sick was science fiction. People might attribute illness to bad air miasma theory, imbalances in bodily humors, divine displeasure, or just plain bad luck. So, washing your hands meticulously before handling food wasn't a thing. Washing your hands at all wasn't a particularly frequent or thorough activity for many. You might rinse off, sure, but scrubbing with soap, that was a luxury or reserved for laundry. Not typically personal hygiene, especially not before dinner. This fundamental ignorance of microbiology meant that every step of the food chain was a potential death trap. Consider the water. Where does the water for cooking and drinking come from? Rivers, streams, wells, cisterns. These sources were often shared with places where people dumped waste, where animals drank, and where bodies might even end up. There were no sophisticated filtration systems, no chlorination. You dip your bucket into a river that's just downstream from where someone is relieving themselves, or where tannery waste is being dumped, and you're effectively collecting a cocktail of whatever pathogens are thriving in that lovely environment. Boiling water was known to make it safer, but that wasn't always practical for large quantities or for drinking water throughout the day. This is one reason why things like weak ale or beer, which were made with boiled water, were often considered safer to drink than plain water, even for children. It wasn't because they understood why it was safer, just that fewer people seemed to get sick from it. Mainstream historical fact alert. This preference for low-alcohol drinks like ale over water is well documented across medieval Europe, largely due to the boiling process involved in brewing, making it a less risky beverage choice. And then there were the roommates. Not the human kind, though overcrowding was also an issue, but the four-legged, six-legged, and zero-legged kind. Rats, mice, flies, cockroaches, lice. They were everywhere. Kitchens, larders, dining halls. They were open buffets for vermin. Rats would scurry over stored grains and meats, leaving behind droppings and urine. Flies would land on rotting refuse and then happily buzz over to the pot you're stirring or the loaf of bread cooling on the table, tracking all sorts of delightful things. A quirky tidbit. Medieval doctors sometimes recommended specific foods or herbs to repel vermin, like strewing pennyroyal to ward off fleas, suggesting an awareness of the nuisance, but still no understanding of the diseases they carried. Imagine sharing your pantry with a family of rats, all unknowingly contributing to your next meal's potential for food poisoning. It adds a certain rustic charm, doesn't it? Like a medieval health inspection would just involve counting how many rats you don't see rather than how many you do. The sheer volume of animal waste, human waste, and general refuse lying around added to the problem. Waste disposal systems were rudimentary at best, non-existent at worst. Privies might empty into ditches or rivers. Animal carcasses were often just left where they fell or piled up outside city walls. All of this provided fertile ground for bacteria and attracted even more vermin. The conditions in medieval kitchens, while varying by status, were often far from sterile. Open fires produced smoke and soot. Surfaces weren't easily sanitized. Utensils were basic and might not be thoroughly cleaned between uses. Meat might hang for days, exposed to the air and flies. Vegetables might be washed in contaminated water. It's less a kitchen, more a biological experiment waiting to happen. You just hoped you were lucky enough to eat the part that wasn't actively trying to kill you. This constant exposure to pathogens meant that foodborne illness was incredibly common and often deadly. What we'd call a nasty stomach bug today could easily lead to death from dehydration or sepsis in the Middle Ages. The line between bad food and fatal illness was terrifyingly thin. People got sick from contaminated food and water all the time, attributing it to curses, witches, or just the vagaries of life, never suspecting the tiny agents they couldn't see. Historians still argue whether the chronic low-level exposure to various pathogens from poor hygiene actually built up a certain level of societal immunity to some diseases, or if it simply kept populations constantly vulnerable and suppressed overall health and lifespan. Either way, you're probably better off just smelling the medieval food from a safe distance. Trust me on this one. So, you've trudged home through the mud. Maybe you managed to avoid the pigsty this time, and you finally collapse onto the worn floorboards inside your little dwelling. You've got food. Maybe that grain we talked about earlier. Perhaps a scraggly bit of vegetable from your garden patch. Or if you're lucky, a sliver of dried meat. But now, how do you cook it? Well, let's manage your expectations right away. This isn't a brightly lit, gadget-filled modern kitchen. Forget your induction stoves, your air fryers, your immersion circulators. What you have is elemental. Mostly, cooking happens over an open fire, right there, in a hearth built into the floor, or maybe just a cleared patch of ground with some stones to contain the embers. Smoke fills the air, stinging your eyes a little, clinging to everything. Your clothes, the walls, your hair. You get used to it. Mostly. It's not just for warmth, although it serves that purpose too. It's the primary heat source for turning raw ingredients into something digestible, or at least less likely to give you the galloping trots. You're constantly managing flames, pushing embers around, trying to get a consistent heat that, frankly, you rarely achieve. Everything smells faintly of wood smoke, which is, charming in a persistently irritating kind of way. Now, while you could technically roast something directly in the embers or on a spit over the flames, and sometimes you do, especially if it's something small like a rabbit or a bird you were fortunate enough to snare, the absolute reigning champion of cooking methods in your world is boiling. Yes, good old boiling. Why? Because it's efficient with fuel and requires minimal technique. You just need a pot, some water, and heat. You can throw almost anything into a pot of boiling water. Grains, vegetables, tough cuts of meat that would be inedible otherwise. It softens things up, makes starches digestible, and theoretically, makes things a bit safer to eat by killing some nasties. Assuming you boil it long enough, this is your daily bread. Or perhaps more accurately, your daily pottage or stew. Speaking of pots, what do you use? Well, you don't have a gleaming set of stainless steel cookware. Your main tools are basic pots, and, if you're slightly better off or share one with neighbors, a large cauldron. These are heavy, often made of iron or sometimes clay. The cauldron hangs over the fire on a hook or is supported by a tripod. It's the central piece of your cooking life. Everything goes in the cauldron. Breakfast, lunch, dinner often. It's just different iterations of the same basic mush that's been bubbling away. You might add new ingredients on top of leftovers from the day before. It's economical, certainly. But variety isn't exactly the spice of life here. Imagine eating a slightly thicker, vaguely different tasting soup, day after day after day. Remember that bit about surviving? Yeah, this is part of why it was tough. There's really a profound lack of variety and refinement in preparation for most households. You're not sautéing delicate scallops. You're not creating elaborate sauces. You're not baking delicate pastries unless you're incredibly wealthy. Which you are decidedly not. Remember, your goal is sustenance, not culinary artistry. You have a limited range of ingredients dictated by the season and what you can grow or forage or occasionally trade for. You have simple tools, a knife, maybe a basic mortar and pestle to grind some herbs or grains, and your trusty pot or cauldron. That's pretty much it. Flavorings are minimal, maybe some salt, if you can afford it or live near a source, and a few common herbs if you grow them yourself. Spices from far-off lands. Those are for the very rich indeed. Exotic treasures that might as well be from another planet. A quirky tidbit. Because boiling was so common, the word pottage, or stew, basically just meant anything boiled in a pot. There wasn't a strict recipe. It was whatever you had on hand thrown in with some water. Leftover scraps, some dried peas, a turnip, maybe a bone for flavor. It was the ultimate fridge clean-out meal. Every single day. Mainstream historical fact. The use of open hearths in homes without proper chimneys was a major contributor to respiratory illnesses and eye problems throughout history, particularly before chimneys became more common in later periods. Imagine constantly breathing in that smoke. Historians still argue whether the limited diet and simple cooking methods of the common folk contributed more to general health issues, or whether the lack of variety was compensated for by using the whole animal and seasonal vegetables, ensuring a broader range of nutrients than we might initially assume. It's a fun debate, right? Boiling everything certainly destroys some nutrients, but it also makes tough plant fibers and meat connective tissue digestible. The point is, don't come home expecting a gourmet meal. You'll get a steaming, often bland, sometimes smoky, pot of whatever was available. You eat it with a simple spoon, or perhaps just bits of bread or even your hands, scooping directly from the communal pot or a wooden bowl. It's filling, usually warm, and gets you through the day. But refined, diverse, flavorful. By modern standards, not a chance. It's basic. It's survival cooking at its most fundamental. And honestly, after a long day, you're usually just grateful there's something warm to put in your stomach, even if it tastes pretty much like yesterday's mush. Okay, so you've seen how they live. You've seen the spaces they inhabit, from the grand halls to the cramped cottages. Now, let's talk about fuel. Let's talk about what kept these people going. Or, in many cases, barely going. We're stepping into the kitchen, or perhaps just the hearth, to understand the absolute chasm between the feast and the famine. You stand now at the threshold of a lord's dining hall. It's vast. It smells overwhelmingly of roasted meats, rich spices, and something sweet, probably honeyed wine. The table groans under the weight. Remember how we talked about status nowhere? Is it more obvious than on a plate? You see platters piled high with venison, boar, capons, swans, peacocks even, sometimes prepared in elaborate, frankly, bizarre ways. Imagine a swan, cooked and then sewn back into its feathers to look alive on the table, or a pie where live birds burst out when you cut it open. Yes, that was a thing. It's less a meal. more a performance art piece designed to scream an "I am rich" every time you take a bite. The sheer variety is staggering. Fish hauled from distant waters, exotic spices, remember how expensive those were, imported from faraway lands, transforming simple dishes into status symbols, saffron turning rice golden, ginger adding a punch, cloves perfuming meat. They eat multiple courses, each more extravagant than the last. Sugar, a luxury, is sculpted into elaborate subtleties, edible artworks depicting mythical scenes or coats of arms. It's a world away from basic sustenance. This isn't just eating, it's conspicuous consumption taken to an art form. You might think, okay, maybe just one course is like slightly over the top. Nope, it's a procession of excess. And let's be honest, some of it sounds interesting. Roast hedgehog. Anyone apparently, the medieval equivalent of trying that new fusion restaurant down the street. Now, gently, let's step outside that fragrant hall and into a peasant hovel. The smell here is different. It's wood smoke, damp earth, and something basic, probably simmering, on the table, if there is one beyond a simple plank. You see, consistency. Mostly, you see bread, often a coarse loaf made from rye, barley, or oats, maybe mixed with peas or beans if grain is scarce. White bread. That's for the nobles. It requires sifting out the bran, which is less efficient and thus more expensive. You see pottage, a thick stew made from whatever vegetables are available. Cabbage, onions, leeks, perhaps some peas or beans, thickened with grain. Meat is a rarity. Maybe a tough bit of salted pork fat or bacon. Perhaps some scraggly fowl if they're lucky. But red meat? Game. Entirely out of reach. Fish only if they live near a river and have permission to fish. Or it's a church feast day requiring fish. Their diet is fundamentally grain-based, supplemented by seasonal vegetables and legumes. It's monotonous, nutrient-poor compared to the variety enjoyed by the elite, and utterly reliant on the success of the harvest. They aren't eating peacock. They're eating the same gray gruel. Day after day. It provides calories? Sure, but lacks essential vitamins and proteins. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of eating instant ramen for every single meal. But the ramen recipe hasn't changed in 500 years. And here's the cruel reality, the constant, gnawing fear of famine. Remember those weather patterns we talked about? Or the impact of disease and war disrupting planting and harvesting? A single bad harvest, a long drought, excessive rain, a blight, or even a conflict passing through the land could decimate the food supply. For the nobility, a poor harvest might mean fewer courses at dinner, or a slightly less exotic spice order. For the peasant, it means starvation. Their narrow margin of survival evaporates. You see families tightening belts, selling meager possessions, sometimes resorting to eating acorns, roots, or even bark to survive. This wasn't a rare event. Famines were a recurring nightmare throughout the period, sometimes lasting for years and wiping out significant portions of the population. The Great Famine of the early 14th century, for example, caused widespread death across Europe, starkly illustrating how fragile the food supply was. Historians still argue whether the peasant diet, while monotonous, was sufficient in calories during good years. But there's no debate about its vulnerability. The reliance on a few staple crops meant that if those failed, everything failed. The ability to access diverse food sources, to store large reserves, and to import when necessary was a luxury strictly reserved for the wealthy. The poor ate what they grew, and if the ground gave nothing, they had nothing. This stark divide in diet wasn't just about taste or preference. It was about life and death, a daily reminder of where you stood on the precarious ladder of medieval society. You're not just seeing food, You're seeing the literal embodiment of power and vulnerability on a plate, or in an empty bowl. Okay, so you've got your feet up. Maybe you're wrapped in a blanket, feeling all cozy. Right? Good. Now, imagine that feeling, but add a layer of, well, let's just call it external dietary control. Because if you think choosing what to eat is sometimes hard, now, picture this someone else making a big chunk of the decisions for you, based entirely on the calendar and, specifically, on what the church was telling you. You see, back then, religion wasn't just something you did on a Sunday, or maybe logged into a live stream for. It was woven into the very fabric of daily life. And that included your dinner plate, the church. This massive, influential institution didn't just offer spiritual guidance, it offered gastronomic regulations. And oh boy, did they regulate. The biggest player in this game was fasting. Now, when you hear fasting today, you might think intermittent fasting, maybe skipping breakfast, trying to feel lighter. But in medieval Europe, we're talking about a specific, religiously mandated avoidance of certain foods on certain days. The granddaddy of these was Lent, that 40-day stretch before Easter. You remember those cycles of the year we talked about, how farming dictated so much. Well, the church layered its own calendar right on top, creating rhythms of feasting and, crucially, fasting during Lent and on countless other days throughout the year. Fridays, Wednesdays sometimes, Advent, various vigils, Ember Days. You were expected to abstain. Abstain from what? Primarily, meat. That meant no beef, no pork, no chicken, no lamb, no creature that walked or flew, essentially. This wasn't just a suggestion, it was a rule, enforced with varying degrees of strictness depending on the time period and location. And yes, often tied to the idea of penance, of spiritual discipline, of remembering Christ's suffering. Give up something you like, the church effectively said, as a form of piety. And back then, meat was often the most prized food, a symbol of wealth and celebration. Giving it up was a real sacrifice for many. So, suddenly, depending on the day, half of your usual pantry might be off limits. You can almost hear the sigh in the medieval kitchen. Okay, it's Friday. Again, what can we even make? This dramatically reshaped consumption patterns. Instead of the roast chicken or pork stew you might enjoy on a non-fasting day, your meal options pivoted hard towards other categories. Fish became incredibly important, really important. If it swam, you could probably eat it. This surge in demand for fish during fasting periods meant that fishing industries boomed, and methods of preserving fish, like salting or drying, were essential to ensure supplies were available even inland. You see elaborate medieval recipes for everything from baked cod to lamprey stew, all designed to be filling and palatable while adhering to the rules. But it wasn't just fish, vegetables, pulses like peas and beans, bread, and eggs usually, though sometimes eggs were restricted too. Especially during the stricter parts of Lent, formed the backbone of the fasting diet. Think thick vegetable pottages, lentil stews, various forms of bread, and, if you were lucky, cheese. The focus shifted from animal protein to plant-based sustenance in aquatic life. This had interesting knock-on effects on agriculture and trade. Demand for certain crops or preserved goods would spike dramatically during fasting seasons. Now, about that fish rule. Historians still argue whether the sheer economic and social pressure of these rules led to, shall we say, creative interpretations. It's a little-known tidbit, but some historical records suggest that the definition of fish sometimes stretched to include things you definitely would not think of as fish today. Beavers, for instance, were occasionally classified as Fish, because they lived in water. Puffins, too. Yes, you heard that right. Imagine sitting down to your Friday meal and being served beaver tail. Because, it's basically seafood. Makes you appreciate your fish and chips, doesn't it? Or maybe just your cheese sandwich. This constant oscillation between meat days and fasting days meant your cooking methods and even your available ingredients were dictated by the church calendar. It wasn't just what you ate, but perhaps even how you ate it. Fasting meals were often seen as simpler, more austere, in keeping with the spirit of penance. Though, if you were wealthy, your simple fasting meal might still involve expensive imported dried fish or elaborately prepared vegetable dishes that would make a modern vegan chef jealous. So, fasting didn't always mean eating poorly, just eating differently. Think about it. Your weekly meal plan wasn't just about what was in season or what you could afford, but primarily about what day of the week it was. Tuesday, meat's probably fine. Friday, absolutely not. It forced a level of nutritional variety, perhaps accidentally. You couldn't just live on meat and bread. You had to incorporate other things on those fasting days. It wasn't a health trend, but a religious requirement that had profound dietary consequences. So, next time you're deciding what to have for dinner, maybe spare a thought for your historical counterparts who had a divine planner already setting their menu for nearly half the year. Talk about taking the decision fatigue out of cooking. Sort of. You just had to remember if it was a beaver day or a beef day. A mainstream historical fact here is just how widespread and deeply ingrained the Friday abstinence from meat was throughout centuries of Christian practice in Europe. It was a defining dietary marker for millions. It wasn't just for monks or particularly pious individuals. It was a rule for the general population, a fundamental aspect of religious observance that directly impacted the marketplace, the farm, and the home kitchen. It shows you the immense power institutions like the church held, not just over people's souls, but over their stomachs too. You couldn't just wander down to the medieval equivalent of a butcher shop on a Friday and expect to find anything you could actually eat. You were steering clear, heading instead for the fishmonger or the greengrocer. It really was eating by the calendar, with the church holding the date book. You might think that because you're living down there by the Mediterranean coast, soaking up that sunshine and, well, mostly eating stale bread and questionable fish. Your food life is totally different from the poor soul shivering up in Scandinavia trying to make leekin taste like dinner. And yes, there were differences. Absolutely. You'd see more olive oil and wine in the south, more butter, ale, and smoked fish in the north. Coastal areas had better access to seafood when the weather allowed and the boats didn't sink, while inland regions relied more on game if they were wealthy or sneaky enough and farmed animals. Different kinds of grains were prevalent depending on the soil and climate. Wheat often favored where it could grow. Rye and barley were hardier staples elsewhere. Regional dishes developed. Local spices or herbs became popular. It wasn't a bland monolith across the entire continent. Thankfully, because that would be even more depressing. But here's the twist. The historical punchline, if you will, underneath all those regional variations. The fundamental, grinding, soul-crushing problems of medieval eating were startlingly universal. It didn't matter if you were a French peasant, an English farmer, a German artisan, or an Italian merchant. You were wrestling with the same basic demons in your pantry. Remember how we talked about food going bad, fast? This wasn't just a problem in one corner of Europe. Whether you were trying to keep meat from spoiling in the humid summer heat of Italy, or hoping your stored grain didn't mold in the damp chill of Northern Europe, the lack of refrigeration was a continent-wide nightmare. Salting, smoking, pickling, drying. These weren't regional preferences. They were desperate necessities everywhere. You're chowing down on overly salted fish in England. Someone in Hungary is probably doing the same with meat. Your cheese smells suspiciously alive. Welcome to the club, pal. It was a race against the clock, a constant battle to keep your food from becoming something else entirely. And usually not something better. Oh, look, it's winter again, time to eat whatever you managed to preserve or store from the brief glorious burst of summer and autumn abundance. Seasonality wasn't just a slight inconvenience like strawberries being expensive in January today. It dictated your entire diet for months on end. Every single region faced this brutal cycle. The sweet, fresh fruits and vegetables of summer vanished. You relied on root vegetables that could be stored, dried legumes, preserved meats, and whatever hardy greens might survive a frost. Historians still argue whether the hungry gaps, periods just before harvest when old stores were depleted, were a universal annual crisis or more localized disasters. But the fundamental dependence on seasonal availability was a shared reality for everyone, everywhere. You weren't getting fresh lettuce in December, no matter how much money you had. Ah, the invisible enemy. Remember that questionable water supply we discussed, or the general lack of understanding about germs? This wasn't unique to one city or one country. Food preparation hygiene, or the lack thereof, was a pan-European issue. Animal waste near wells check, hands not being washed before handling food, double check, flies landing on everything triple check. The risk of foodborne illness was a constant, silent threat, uniting people across borders in their shared vulnerability to a dodgy meal. Eating out was especially risky. You often had no idea what was going on behind that kitchen door. And frankly, maybe it was better that way. You just hoped for the best and braced yourself for the worst. A quirky tidbit. Medieval physicians sometimes recommended eating less fruit because they thought it could cause fevers or bad humors if eaten in excess, probably due to it spoiling quickly or being washed in contaminated water. Maybe they weren't entirely wrong, just spectacularly wrong about the why. Money talks, and in the Middle Ages, it screamed. Usually about how you didn't have enough of it to eat well. Cost was a massive barrier everywhere. While the types of expensive food might vary slightly, truffles in one area, specific imported spices in another, the principle was the same meat was usually expensive. Fresh produce out of season was prohibitively so. And anything imported like those precious spices we mentioned earlier cost a fortune. The vast majority of the population, from Portugal to Poland, lived on simple, cheap staples grains in bread or porridge, legumes, and whatever they could grow themselves or forage. Eating well meant eating enough, and maybe getting some basic protein in the form of cheese or eggs, if you were lucky. Luxuries like sugar, almonds, or foreign fruits were strictly for the elite, binding the poor across the continent in a shared, financially enforced dietary simplicity. And finally, the soul-crusher monotony. Because preservation methods were limited, seasonality was king, and cost-restricted variety. Your diet was likely incredibly repetitive. Day after day, week after week, month after month, you'd be eating variations on the same theme. Rye bread, bean stew, maybe some salted pork fat if you were fortunate. Imagine eating porridge made of the same grain, maybe with a different vegetable if the season allowed, for breakfast, lunch, and dinner for days on end. This wasn't unique to the English peasant. The German serf was likely eating their own regional version of gruel 3 times a day, and the Spanish laborer their version of bread and beans forever. This shared monotony, this lack of culinary excitement, was a binding force across medieval Europe. You might dream of roast swan, but you were eating kale. Again, a mainstream historical fact to tie this together. The staple diet for the vast majority of medieval Europeans, regardless of region, was bread or porridge made from cereals, often providing 70–80% of their caloric intake. That's a lot of grain. So while the specific ingredients might have shifted depending on the different dirt you were standing on, the fundamental same problems were everywhere. Preservation woes, seasonal shortages, hygiene risks, crushing cost, and relentless monotony. These were the true constants of the medieval diet, uniting the continent not just in trade or politics, but in the daily, often tedious struggle to simply stay fed. It makes you appreciate that endless aisle at the modern grocery store, doesn't it? Even if you just buy the same 5 things every week, at least you could buy something different if you wanted to. They didn't have that luxury. Okay, you've journeyed with me through the dimly lit halls of medieval kitchens, felt the rough texture of their bread, and maybe even imagined the questionable aroma of a long-stored sausage. Now, as we ease towards the end of this particular dive, let's just take a moment, a really slow breath, and recap the simple, stark truth. Medieval food, yeah? It was rough. Really, really rough. You remember talking about the harvests, right? How everything depended on the sun and the rain deciding to cooperate just enough at just the right times. You lived and died by the success of those fields. If the weather turned sour, if pests descended, if war ravaged the land just as the crops ripened, well, you were facing a year, maybe more, of gnawing hunger. It wasn't just inconvenient, it was catastrophic. There wasn't a supermarket down the road with endless shelves of backups. What you grew, what you could preserve, or what your lord might dole out from his stores if you were really lucky, was all you had. The sheer unpredictability of the food supply, tied so directly to the whims of nature, made simply getting enough calories a constant, low-level anxiety. It's a feeling we thankfully don't have to wake up with most days. You know, and the variety. Oh, the glorious non-existent variety. For most people, most of the time, life revolved around grain, puddings, porridges, thick stews, and yes, bread, usually tough, dark bread, maybe mixed with rye, or even pulses if things were tight. Meat was a rare luxury for the common folk, often only seen after a hunt if you were allowed to hunt, or when an animal had to be slaughtered. Fish was important, especially on religious days, but again, access depended on location and season. Fresh fruits and vegetables. You ate them when they were in season, and then they were gone. There were no refrigerated trucks bringing strawberries in January or air-freighted avocados. Your diet contracted dramatically in winter, shrinking down to stored grains, pulses, salted or smoked meats and fish, and maybe some root vegetables if you'd had a good cellar. Imagine eating essentially the same few bland things, day in, day out, for months on end. Modern picky eaters wouldn't last a week. It makes that forgotten carton of questionable yogurt in the back of your fridge seem like a 5-star banquet, doesn't it? Then there was the whole, is this going to kill me aspect? Food safety wasn't exactly a science. Preservation methods were crude drying, salting lots of salt. Remember how expensive it was. Smoking, pickling, or just storing things in cool, dark places like cellars, hoping for the best. Understanding of spoilage was minimal. If it didn't smell too awful or look too obviously fuzzy, you might just eat it and hope your stomach was strong enough. Water sources were often contaminated, leading to widespread use of weak ale or cider as safer alternatives, which, while perhaps more hydrating than suspect water, added their own dietary quirks and calorie counts. Waste disposal and sanitation around food preparation areas were rudimentary at best. You were constantly rolling the dice with every mouthful. Mainstream historical fact alert. Grains, particularly wheat, rye, and barley, formed the absolute cornerstone of the medieval diet, providing the vast majority of calories for the population across Europe. It wasn't just a food source, it was the food source. Think about the logistics. Getting food from field to table was a labor-intensive, fragile chain. Harvesting by hand, threshing, milling, often paying the Lord for the privilege, storing, preserving. Every step was prone to failure, spoilage, or theft. The concept of food surplus that we take for granted, where there's always more than enough available, simply didn't exist for most medieval people. They lived much closer to the edge of scarcity than we can easily comprehend. It's why things like food riots, though thankfully a lesser-known tidbit today, were a real and terrifying possibility when supplies ran critically low. People weren't just complaining about prices, they were facing starvation. Historians still argue whether mass starvation was a regular occurrence or more localized and episodic. But there's no debate that hunger and malnutrition were ever-present threats for large segments of the population. Life revolved around acquiring and keeping food. Feasts for the wealthy were extravagant precisely because everyday life was so constrained and often meager. The ability to display abundance was a show of power and security in a world where food security was the ultimate luxury. So, when you open your fridge or pantry tonight, packed with choices, colors, and things that are guaranteed mostly not to make you violently ill, just take a second. Consider the sheer grinding difficulty faced by medieval people just to put something on the table. It wasn't about balanced meals or exciting flavors. It was about survival, getting enough energy to work the fields so you could grow food for next year. It was a perpetual cycle of struggle, all centered around that fundamental, sometimes elusive, need to simply feed yourself and your family. It really puts things into perspective, doesn't it? Makes you appreciate that slightly sad-looking lettuce in the crisper a little more. Monk. And with that, we gently drift towards the end of our time exploring the medieval plate. You can feel the echoes of those long-ago meals fading now. The distant sound of pestles grinding grain, the faint scent of smoke from a hearth fire, the rough feel of homespun cloth. We've covered quite a journey, haven't we? From the soil to the trencher, through feast and famine, exploring a world where food wasn't just sustenance, but a constant, sometimes precarious focus of life itself. The world outside your window is still there, waiting, but maybe now you'll see it a little differently. Appreciate the simple abundance that surrounds you, the quiet hum of your own world, the effortless access to nourishment. Just be with that feeling. Whispering, good night.